In 1793, a man named Ben was paid nothing. He quarried sandstone in the summer heat of a Virginia July, hauled it across unpaved roads, and laid it into the foundation of a building that would become the most recognized symbol of human freedom in the world. Ben didn't own his labor. He didn't own his time. He didn't own his name. The payroll ledger that records his existence lists him only as Ben, followed by the name of the man who owned him. The government cut a check. It went to that man. Ben went back to work. The building was the United States Capitol. And the question nobody in power wanted answered for 200 years is sitting in the National Archives right now, in neat colonial handwriting, waiting for anyone willing to read it. Here is what it says. Most people, if you ask them who built Washington, D.C., will tell you about George Washington, about Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the French architect who mapped the city's grand diagonal boulevards, about the ambition of a young nation projecting confidence onto a swampy riverbank. All of that is true, but there is a version of this story that the textbooks present as complete and is not. In that version, the workers are described as laborers, sometimes craftsmen. Their names don't appear. Their legal status is never mentioned. The architecture gets chapters. The people who built it get a passive sentence, if that. The version you were taught was not a lie. It was a frame, and what got cut out of that frame is the part that explains how American wealth, not just Southern wealth, not just plantation wealth, but the entire early American financial system, actually worked. Here is where it starts. 1790. The new republic is nearly broke, politically fractured, and deadlocked over a single question. Where do you put the capital of a country that doesn't fully trust itself yet? Alexander Hamilton wants the federal government to absorb the war debts of every state, a move that would shift enormous financial power to the center. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison want the capital in the South, close to the planter class that controls the political engine of the new nation. So they make a trade. In a private dinner, no public debate, no congressional vote, just three men at a table. Hamilton gets his debt plan. Jefferson and Madison get the Potomac. The most powerful city in America is chosen not by democratic process, but by private negotiation between men protecting their financial interests. Remember that detail. It matters more than it seems. Now here is what that location actually meant. Virginia and Maryland, the two states that bordered the new federal district, were among the most enslaved jurisdictions in the Western world. When construction began in 1792, the commissioners responsible for building the city had a problem. Skilled labor was scarce. Wages for free workers were rising. The federal budget was already under pressure. But surrounding them, within easy contracting distance, was the largest pool of coerced labor on the continent. The solution had a name. It was called Negro hire, and it was not an improvisation. It was policy. Slaveholders would lease their enslaved workers to the federal government. The government would pay the slaveholder, not the worker, a fixed daily rate. The enslaved person received nothing. No wage, no choice, no record in their own name. The Treasury Department ledgers from this period are specific. They list payments made to slaveholders for Negro hire, with first names attached. Ben, Daniel, Tom, Peter, Shadrach. These men quarried the stone, burned the lime, cleared the timber, and built the walls of a building where, within a decade, their legal status would be debated and protected by the men sitting inside it. Let that land for a moment. The people building the Capitol were the property of people who would govern from it. Now, a different question, one that gets to the psychology underneath all of this. How does an intelligent man rationalize it? Because these were not ignorant men. Jefferson knew. Washington knew. Madison, who helped design the most sophisticated constitutional framework in modern history, knew. Jefferson wrote that slavery was a moral and political depravity, and he enslaved over 600 people across his lifetime. Washington expressed private discomfort with the institution and hired out enslaved workers to build the city bearing his name. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It is something more architecturally precise. When an injustice is sufficiently normalized, when it is embedded in law, in credit markets, an inherited identity, in the daily social fabric of an entire class of powerful men, it stops registering as a moral choice. It becomes infrastructure, as unremarkable as the roads they traveled or the rivers they crossed. And here is the part of this story that most documentaries miss entirely. Slavery was not just a labor system. It was a financial instrument. An enslaved person in early America could be bought, sold, mortgaged, inherited, and used as collateral for bank loans. A Virginia planter could walk into a Baltimore bank, list his enslaved workers as assets on a balance sheet, and walk out with a line of credit. That credit funded construction contracts. Those contracts funded federal building projects. The money moved through the system, changed hands, crossed state lines, passed through northern banks and New England textile mills, and came out the other side looking completely clean. This is the hidden architecture. This is the mechanism that the conventional story never explains. By the time the Capitol was completed, the American financial system, North and South, was built on the same foundation. Northern banks held mortgages on Southern plantations. Philadelphia merchants financed the Atlantic trade. Boston insurance firms underwrote the ships. The institution everyone said was a Southern problem had its financial roots embedded in nearly every major American commercial institution of the era. The money was not regional. The money was national. And then Washington did something that almost no one talks about. For decades after its founding, the capital of American democracy operated one of the largest slave markets in North America. Not in the South, not somewhere discreet. Here, in Washington, D.C., slave pens operated within walking distance of the Capitol building until 1850. The firm of Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading operation in American history, ran its primary depot out of Alexandria, Virginia, a town that was originally part of the federal district itself. Enslaved people were marched in chains through the streets of the Capitol, past the buildings their predecessors had raised from the ground, past the offices of the congressmen who protected the trade, and onto boats headed south. The symbol of freedom was also, simultaneously, the operational headquarters of American slavery's commercial expansion. Now we reach 1862. Congress finally moves to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. It is a moment of moral progress, but read the legislation carefully. The bill included compensation, not for the enslaved people who had worked without wages for generations. For the slaveholders, $300 per enslaved person drawn from the federal treasury. At the final moment of reckoning, with the Civil War already burning, the financial structure of the United States government rewarded ownership one last time. The dome of the Capitol was completed in December 1863. 11 months earlier, Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The building the enslaved had built was finished the same year the country told them they were free. That is not a coincidence history gave us. That is a timestamp. But here is what changes how you see the present. Systems do not end. They transform. The wealth gap between black and white Americans today, measured by economists in the trillions of dollars, is not a mystery. It is not a cultural phenomenon. It is compound interest on an unpaid debt. Enslaved workers built wealth they could not own. Their descendants inherited that dispossession. The wealth itself was converted into land, into institutions, into political influence, into generational education, and it compounded on one side of the ledger across 160 years. This is not metaphor. This is arithmetic. In the last 2 decades, a growing number of institutions have quietly begun auditing their historical ties to slavery. Georgetown University discovered that its 19th century financial survival depended on the sale of 272 enslaved people. Harvard found that portions of its early endowment traced to slaveholder donations. The Bank of England acknowledged that many of its founding directors were slaveholders or slave traders. Lloyd's of London, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, spent over a century insuring slave ships and their human cargo. Each audit reveals the same pattern. The money moved. The institutions survived, grew, became the financial and academic infrastructure of the modern world. And the people whose forced labor generated the original capital received, across all of that time, nothing. No wages, no land, no formal acknowledgement, nothing. So what are the rules of this system? The ones that are still operating today. Rule 1. Systems outlast the men who build them. The founders' personal views on slavery were irrelevant compared to the financial architecture they embedded it into. That architecture ran on its own logic for nearly a century. Its downstream effects are still being measured. Rule 2. Erasure is a strategic decision. Removing the workers from the historical record was not negligence. It was a choice, sometimes conscious, sometimes institutional, that consolidated narrative power. Whoever controls how wealth was built controls the legitimacy of who holds it. Rule 3. Capital has a memory that its owners prefer to forget. Assets built on coerced labor do not become neutral over time. They compound. And you cannot understand any modern economy without tracing the genealogy of the capital beneath it. Rule 4. The most powerful rationalizations are the ones that feel like common sense. When an injustice becomes infrastructure, it stops looking like injustice. It looks like the natural order. That is the most dangerous thing a system can do. Make itself invisible. The Capitol Dome was finished in 1863. Ben, the man whose name appears in a ledger as the property of another man, never saw it completed. He left no last name for history to find. No record of where he died or who mourned him. The building stands. His name does not. But the ledger survived. The payroll record survived. The Treasury documents survived, not because anyone intended them to be found, but because bureaucracies keep records, and records are harder to erase than people. The question of whether this city was built by slavery is not, at this point, a question. The records answer it in neat colonial handwriting. The question that has no clean answer, the one that this footage, these documents, and this history leave sitting in your chest when you turn off the screen, is this: what do we do with a foundation we did not choose but still stand on? That is not a historical question. That is a present tense one. If this changed how you see something you thought you already knew, that is exactly what this channel is built to do. The hidden architecture of power, wealth, and history. Every week. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling the thread, because we're just getting started.